I quietly supported my aunt's family for 5 years. They still called me a failure, laughed at me like I was a useless freeloader. Until one dinner, I stood up mid-laughter and silenced the entire table with a truth none of them dared to face. Welcome to Storytime Reddit, everyone. I never thought a single family dinner could change my entire world, but that night, when Aunt Karen raised her glass to toast the upcoming Florida vacation trip, I wasn't even invited to. I knew everything had hit rock bottom. My name is Lucas. I'm 29 years old, and for the past 5 years, I've been silently funding the entire comfortable lifestyle my aunt's family has been enjoying. They live in a 4-bedroom house, drive brand new cars, go on fancy vacations every year, and always show up looking polished in front of friends. But what they didn't know was that the poor loser nephew they constantly mocked was the one quietly footing the bill for all of it. After my parents died in a sudden accident, I inherited an old house and a modest trust fund. They left behind one clear instruction: if possible, use the money to help family. I was only 24 back then, still numb from the loss, and I had one thought in my mind: no one else in the family should struggle the way I did. Aunt Karen was the first to call, talking about how hard it was to keep up with their mortgage. I helped without a single complaint. Then it was Uncle Kevin's broken car, Cousin Brock's credit card debt, rising household expenses during the pandemic, and even home renovations they claimed were for the kids to have a proper space to study. I didn't hesitate. I drove a beat-up 2005 Toyota, lived in a tiny rental apartment, ate instant noodles, and cut every corner I could just to make sure they lived comfortably. And in return, what did I get? Gratitude? I got raised eyebrows, cruel jokes, and judgmental stares every time they saw me in my faded dress shirt. They called me a failure, a leech clinging to dead relatives, the pathetic nephew who just drifts through life. I stayed silent for 5 years. I never asked for recognition, just wanted them to be decent. But even kindness has its limits. That night, when Aunt Karen raised her glass and said, "We're all going to Florida except for Lucas because, well, he's not exactly cut out for trips like that," the whole table burst into laughter. I sat there, face burning, chest tightening. That wasn't just an insult, it was a dagger to the trust I had built over years. The moment I realized I was just an outsider in my own family, I left that dinner early without a word. But the moment I got home, I sat down, opened my laptop, and for the first time in 5 years, I reviewed every single expense from the trust fund. And what I discovered made me freeze. Over $264,800 had been spent on every dollar accounted for, every transfer documented, every receipt neatly categorized. I stared at that number like it was proof of my deepest naivety. What hit me in that moment was a mix of hurt, fury, disappointment, awakening, and a little bit of shame. Not because I had helped them, but because I had allowed them to trample on my kindness without saying a word. But not this time. I wasn't going to stay silent anymore. I used to think that no matter how poorly they treated me, as long as I stayed silent and kept helping, things would eventually get better, that maybe one day they'd recognize the sacrifices I made. But that dinner completely shattered that illusion. When I walked into Aunt Karen's house, something felt off. Everyone was dressed up, the table was already set with grilled meats, wine, and even a fancy French dessert Aunt Karen had never bothered to make when I was around. But no one greeted me. I was just a shadow slipping into a space I had helped create, yet no one actually wanted me there. They sat me at the end of the table, right next to the jammed window I had once paid to fix. As I sat down, Brock glanced over with a smug smirk, while Marcos wrinkled his nose like the smell of being poor had followed me into the house. Aunt Karen poured wine for everyone except me and joked, "You're probably still driving that old car, huh? No need to drink, you already don't belong here." The whole table erupted in laughter. I forced a smile, but inside I was crumbling. The dinner went on with stories about their upcoming Florida vacation, plans to renovate the bathroom, and install a new hot tub all paid for with money I had provided. But what really broke me was when Uncle Kevin raised his glass and said, "Let's be thankful no one in this family turned out like my brother." The guy who never amounted to anything. I knew exactly who he was talking about, my father. The man who had worked his whole life, left behind a trust fund, and asked me to use it to help the family. I clenched my fists under the table, trying to stay calm, but then Aunt Karen jumped in. "And Lucas, don't you think you're just like him? Quiet, boring, forgettable. At least he had his youth. You're just dragging along behind everyone, unnoticed." More laughter. At that moment, I felt like I couldn't breathe. A mix of pain, rage, and bitterness surged through me. All those years of quietly supporting them, all the sleepless nights calculating how to stretch the trust fund just to make sure they were okay, and this was how they saw me. I looked around the table, at the people I once believed were family, but all I saw now were selfish, arrogant, hollow faces. I stood up, said nothing, and simply walked out of the house, closing the door gently behind me. No one followed me, no one called my name, they went on with their dinner like I had never existed. And in that moment, for the first time in 5 years, I saw a truth I had always avoided. I didn't belong there, they didn't see me as family. I was just a walking wallet, a lifeline they could exploit, a sacrifice they never had to thank. But something shifted inside me that night. I knew what I had to do next. Not for revenge, but to reclaim myself. And I began planning. That night, when I got back to my small apartment, I couldn't sleep. The mocking words from that dinner kept replaying in my head like a broken recording stuck on loop. I lay there, restless, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and disappointment, until one thought hit me: if I really was as stupid as they said, then how stupid had I been for the past 5 years? I got up, opened my laptop, and logged into the trust account my parents had left behind. Every expense showed up, every transaction, every carefully noted detail I had saved. I always believed in being transparent, organized, just in case anyone ever needed to verify anything, but I never imagined I'd be the one needing to look at it all again. And when the total number appeared, I could hardly believe my eyes. Over $264,800. That's how much I had withdrawn to cover Aunt Karen's family's expenses over the past 5 years. Mortgage payments, insurance, 2 roof repairs, a new car for Uncle Kevin, household bills, credit card debt for Brock, 1 semester of Marcos's college tuition, and hundreds of other little things I had once thought were simply what family does for each other. But now, every line item felt like another cut into my trust. Every dollar spent was proof that I wasn't treated like a person they saw me as a tool. I scrolled all the way down to the most recent transaction: a deposit to an event planning company, a down payment for a massive party at a lakefront villa. I opened the confirmation email they had forwarded to me, with a message that read, "Don't worry, Lucas will cover the rest. He never says no." I froze. That was the party they were planning. The one I wasn't invited to. The reason? Didn't want to be embarrassed in front of friends because Lucas dresses like a bum, talks like an idiot, and works some loser job. I sat there in silence, watching the screen blur as tears welled up. Not because I regretted the money, but because I regretted myself. The version of Lucas who believed in family, who thought being kind was enough to earn decency in return. But the truth is, some people will always see kindness as a resource to exploit, will drain you dry, and then turn their backs like you never existed. In that moment, I felt 5 emotions flood through me all at once: pain from betrayal, rage from being used, disappointment in what my family had become, clarity from finally seeing the truth, and above all, a deep, aching sorrow for the part of me that had stayed silent for so long. But I didn't break. I took a deep breath, wiped my face, and opened a blank document. I started writing a plan. Not another plan to support them, but a plan to free myself from them. I had given away my kindness in silence. Now it was time to take my voice back. And I would do it step by step, with the calm resolve of someone who has finally seen through the illusion they've been blinded by for far too long. I didn't feel angry anymore. What I felt now was a kind of cold clarity. Once you've truly seen the faces of people who once called themselves your family, you can't go back to being naive. And I had no intention of going back. I spent the next 3 days quietly preparing. No angry texts, no confrontations. I just started collecting every bit of proof, from bank statements and emails to payment confirmations and service invoices with my name on them. I sent everything to my parents' attorney, Mr. Reed, the man who had helped me manage the trust ever since they passed. When I explained everything, he let out a long sigh and said, "You've given them more than they ever deserved. Now it's time to protect yourself." We agreed to cut off all financial support within 60 days, giving them a short window to get their affairs in order. But before making anything official, I needed them to understand what was coming, and I knew exactly when to do it: the next family dinner they invited me to. I got the message from Aunt Karen. "This Sunday, 6 p.m. Don't be late. The family needs to talk." No apology, no explanation for what had happened before. They weren't reaching out of concern. They wanted to humiliate me again. I knew it, and this time I wasn't coming empty-handed. I brought a briefcase filled with document-itemized records of every dollar I had spent, a formal legal statement confirming the end of my financial support, and a handwritten letter addressed to each of them. Before I left, I stood in front of the mirror for a long time, not to fix my appearance, but to really look at myself, the man who had spent years living for others, completely forgetting his own worth. When I walked into the house, no one stood to greet me. Just like always, they were already gathered around the table with red wine, fancy appetizers, and sarcastic remarks ready to go. Brock smirked. "Well, look who finally showed up. Thought you'd be too scared to face us." Marcos chimed in. "Let's hope he doesn't storm out halfway this time, huh, Lucas?" I smiled faintly but didn't respond. I pulled out a chair, sat down, placed the briefcase beside me, and made eye contact with every single one of them. Aunt Karen spoke first. "Lucas, the family's talked. We think it's best if you limit your appearances. You live too differently. You don't really fit in with the family's spirit. Please understand, nobody hates you. It's just, you make people uncomfortable." I nodded. "I understand. And because I understand, I brought something tonight. I think you all need to see it." I opened the case and laid out copies of the records, one in front of each person. The relaxed expressions on their faces shifted instantly to shock. I spoke clearly, calmly, without a hint of hesitation. Over the past 5 years, the total comes to $264,800. All of it came from my parents' trust. Every bill, every transaction, it's all here. Who do you think paid for everything? Who signed off on every loan, every repair, every expense? Me. The room froze. No one said a word for several seconds, and then chaos erupted. Aunt Karen stuttered, "That can't be right. You're joking, right?" Brock snatched his packet, flipped through it, then threw it on the table. "You've been tracking us? What's wrong with you?" But I just sat there, silent, calm. Because finally the truth was out, and this was only the beginning. None of them apologized. Not one looked at me with even a hint of gratitude. Instead, after a brief moment of stunned silence, the room exploded with anger. Marcos shot up from his seat, slammed his hand on the table, and growled, "Who do you think you are? Coming here like some kind of teacher trying to lecture us?" Brock let out a bitter laugh, but his eyes were clearly filled with irritation. "You tracked every dollar and brought it here to humiliate us? Or were you just waiting for this chance to play hero?" Aunt Karen didn't speak for several seconds. She just stared at the papers in front of her like they might catch fire. Then she finally looked up, slow and cold. "So you kept track of every time you helped us? You kept score? What's noble about that? This is family, not a business transaction." I looked at them, but I didn't feel pain. I didn't feel anger. What I felt was something sharper, something colder clarity. I pulled out the letters I had written beforehand and handed one to each of them. I didn't come here to shame anyone. I just wanted everyone to know the truth. And starting today, I'm no longer the one quietly keeping this family afloat. I'll be ending all financial support in 60 days. That's how long you have to figure things out. No one responded. The room fell into a heavy silence. I stood up, grabbed my briefcase, and walked to the door. But just as my hand reached the doorknob, I heard Aunt Karen's voice, this time without sarcasm, without condescension, just raw panic. "Lucas, if you do this, we'll lose everything. The house, the car, Brock's debt isn't paid off yet." I didn't turn around. I just said one sentence calmly, "Then maybe it's time everyone learned how to live within what they actually have." That very night, my phone stopped ringing. Messages came flooding in, pleas, threats, even vague legal warnings. Some called me a traitor to the family. Others accused me of being a self-righteous hypocrite. But not a single one asked how I felt. Not one of them said they understood or admitted they had done anything wrong. The next morning, I went to Mr. Reed's office and signed the paperwork officially terminating all trust fund support. Their accounts would be frozen within 60 days, and none of their expenses would ever be tied to me again. I also had all financial records transferred to a private platform, something only I could access. And just as I expected, 3 days later, they showed up at my apartment, no warning. When I opened the door, they stood there tense, anxious, and angry. Aunt Karen tried to keep her voice steady, but I could see the fear in her eyes. "Can't you reconsider? You know we can't manage without you. There's still so much left. Marcos's tuition hasn't even been paid." I stayed quiet for a long moment before replying, "Do you remember that dinner? The one where you said I'd always be a useless disappointment like my dad? That was the first time I truly felt sorry for him. Because now I realize he probably sat at this very same table, treated like a stranger by the people who were supposed to love him." Aunt Karen went pale. No one said another word. They just stood there in silence, and I closed the door, not out of hatred, but because for the first time in my life I chose to love myself. I used to think that once the truth came out and all financial support was cut off, they'd quietly retreat, accept the consequences, and fade from my life. But I had severely underestimated the desperate grip of people who had grown used to living off someone else's kindness. As soon as the official notice went out from my lawyer stating that all support would end in 60 days, Aunt Karen's family spiraled into full-blown panic. They dropped the polite facades, the half-hearted sarcasm. This time, they showed who they really were. They started calling non-stop, leaving dozens of messages a day, some begging, others threatening legal action. One morning, I stepped out of my apartment and found a note shoved under the door, scribbled in red ink, "If you do this, we'll lose everything." Don't let blood turn to bitterness. I just let out a cold laugh. Family? If that's what family looks like, then it was nothing more than a one-sided, toxic arrangement that drained me of every dollar and every ounce of emotional energy for 5 years. The breaking point came on a Friday night. I had just gotten home from work when there was a pounding on my door. I opened it to find all three of them, Aunt Karen, Uncle Kevin, and Brock, standing there. No shame, no hesitation. They stepped into my apartment like they still had some kind of authority over me, like I was still the naive nephew they used to manipulate. "Lucas," Aunt Karen said, trying to keep her tone composed, "you're tearing this family apart. You think you can just live peacefully while we lose everything?" I looked her dead in the eye. "I'm not tearing anything apart. I'm just stopping the lifeline to a system with no conscience." Uncle Kevin jumped in. "Your dad's gone, but I'm still here. You think you're better than this family? You're a traitor." Brock didn't say a word. He just stood there with his arms crossed, his eyes burning with resentment. I knew they weren't there for a conversation. They came to pressure me, to bully me back into being the walking wallet they'd always relied on. But this time, I didn't flinch. I told them to leave. Aunt Karen started crying, but not out of guilt, out of fear. She knew the moment I stepped away, their house of cards would collapse. And sure enough, just a week later, the unraveling began. The bank sent notices about missed mortgage payments. Their credit cards were frozen due to delinquency. Marcos's student loan was suspended because the guarantor is no longer in the picture. I heard they had to cancel their home renovation and remove the unfinished hot tub. All the symbols of their so-called success crumbled like a sandcastle in the tide. But what hurt me the most wasn't their downfall, it was the way they still blamed me. Not once did any of them stop to wonder why someone who had supported them for 5 years would finally walk away. None of them took a moment to look inward. All they saw was this: I wasn't helping them anymore, so I must be the villain. I used to hope for an apology, a hint of remorse, a single look that said they understood. But now I realize that remorse only comes to people with a conscience. And Aunt Karen's family? They never had that to begin with. I had given them chances. I had stayed silent for far too long, and now I choose to stop. Not because I'm cruel, but because I've finally started learning how to love myself, how to live a life where I'm not constantly trying to save people who don't even want to be better. I never imagined that cutting off financial support would bring me such a deep sense of relief. After years of living in silence, I finally took a full breath without feeling bound by fake expectations or twisted gratitude from people who used to call me nephew. And then, I decided to do something I had been holding back for years. I bought back my parents' old house. The same house that had been repossessed by the bank after they passed, because Aunt Karen claimed there wasn't enough money to keep it. Turns out, they never really tried to keep it. They just didn't want to spend their own money. After consulting with a lawyer, I entered the auction, paid the full amount using the remainder of my rightful inheritance, and officially received the keys on a misty afternoon in March. When I opened that old wooden door, the scent of damp wood and dust rushed in, but to me, it felt like stepping into a memory. The tiny footprints of my childhood on the brown tile floor, the sound of my mother's laughter in the kitchen, my dad tinkering with the light fixtures in the living room, all of it still lived there in every brick and every crack. I started cleaning, repairing bit by bit. Not to show off, but to bring back the good parts of my childhood, the ones Aunt Karen's family could never destroy. While I began rebuilding my life, their world unraveled. I didn't have to lift a finger. It all came crashing down, like a natural cycle of truth catching up. Their 4-bedroom home was foreclosed after 2 months of missed mortgage payments. They had to move out in a rush, taking only a few essential bags, leaving behind an unfinished hot tub and overpriced furniture they used to flaunt online. Uncle Kevin's new SUV was repossessed in the middle of the night, right in front of the neighbors. Their credit lines were frozen, and their plans to upgrade their lives became a debt spiral with no escape. I heard Marcos had to pause his education because there was no longer a financial guarantor. He called me once with his voice shaking in frustration. "Why would you do this to us?" I answered with one sentence. "Did you ever ask how I felt during those 5 years?" He went silent, then hung up. No follow-up. And Brock? He posted a long rant online, calling me two-faced, manipulative, and a fake. But strangely, no one in their social circle came to their defense. Maybe because they had never treated anyone well enough to earn loyalty. I didn't celebrate their downfall, and I didn't laugh when they lost everything, but I felt peace. For the first time in years, I knew my silence had ended at the right moment. I was no longer the shadow in the background, mocked the moment I turned away. Now, I was just me living in my parents' house, driving an old car, cooking in a small kitchen, and every night sitting on the porch watching the wind move through the trees my father once planted. No luxury, no noise, no one pretending to love me for what I could give. Just peace. And I realized some things can't be bought with money. But they can be preserved with self-respect and the courage to finally say, enough. I used to think I'd carry bitterness toward Aunt Karen's family for the rest of my life, that the years of being used and disrespected would leave scars that would never fully heal. But over time, I realized that some pain doesn't need to be forgiven, just needs to be let go. And I did that, not by seeking revenge, but by choosing to live a life no longer tied to lies and pretense. After I completely cut financial ties with them, the calls stopped. No more guilt-tripping messages, no more fake apologies or teary accusations. They knew I would never return to being the silent provider. And in that quiet space, I began to ask myself, what should I do with what's left of my parents' legacy? I didn't need a lavish lifestyle. I still worked my regular job, drove my old Toyota, cooked meals at home, and spent more time on things that truly mattered. But I kept hearing my parents' words in my head. If you're in a position to do something good, do it quietly, and do it from the heart. So I used the remaining funds in the trust to start a small scholarship program for kids in my neighborhood. Kids like I used to be lacking opportunity but full of drive. I called it the Little Light, because I believe that when given at the right moment, a small chance can become the guiding light someone desperately needs. Each month, the fund covers tuition, school supplies, and skills-based programs for underprivileged students. None of them know who I am. I don't need the recognition. I just want my parents' money to be used exactly as they would have wanted to help people who deserve it. One time, I was sitting in the local library when I overheard a little girl telling her friend she had just gotten a scholarship to learn programming. Her eyes lit up as she said, "I don't know who gave it to me, but I'm going to try really hard so I can help someone else one day." I cried right then. Not out of sadness, but because it felt like I was finally part of something good again, something I had lost for far too long while being trapped in the chaos of my old family. As for Aunt Karen's family, they stopped reaching out. I heard they had to move into a smaller rental outside the city. Brock apparently took up a second job, and Marcos paused his education to help with expenses. Aunt Karen still refuses to accept that their downfall came from how they chose to live. But I no longer care. I don't feel anger, I don't feel pity, I just feel nothing. And that kind of peace? It's something I never thought I'd be able to achieve. Every morning I wake up, open the door to my parents' old house, breathe in the clean air, and thank the universe that I'm still standing after everything. I live simply, quietly, with no shadows of the past tugging at my shoulders. I'm no longer the man who sat quietly at the dinner table while they mocked me during a meal I paid for. I'm the man who walked out of the dark, who learned how to say no, how to protect himself, and how to pass that light on to someone else. And I truly believe if my parents are watching from somewhere, they're smiling. Not because I became successful, but because I made the right choice.